Next from Chicago, we talked to 3 education officials about the current state of the educational environment and education funding now that the governor has signed funding for schools, but other funds have yet to go through. This runs about 12 minutes.
Roger Eddy, Dr. Brent Clark, and Mike Jacoby, thank you all for joining us on the Illinois Channel. We've talked to you individually over the years about education. Let's discuss a couple of issues as we stand here in November of 2015. The governor signed the funding for schools, but there's still a lot of, as I understand, funding that didn't go through, money that would have gone through tied to grants. Just give us, if you would, a state of the educational environment from each of your perspectives. Roger, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think everybody was relieved. There was a big sigh of relief when the governor signed the education budget early summer. But I think everybody now realizes that even though the appropriations were signed, you still have to have revenue to make the payments associated with it. And I think the last percentage I heard was like 97, 98% of the budget appropriations are being spent, but the revenue is not there. At some point or another, we're going to run out of money. So even though the education appropriations have been made, there's a fear that at some point or another, even though it's appropriated, the actual payments aren't going to be made if something's not done.
And Brent Clark, what as school administrators?
Well, we've been telling our people that we're incredibly fortuitous to have had the K-12 budget put together, able to start school on time, able to run school this fall without interruption. But we look back at March of 15 and we remember the surprise 2.25% cut. We're cautioning administrators to budget incredibly conservative, knowing what Director Eddy just said, that revenues are not keeping up with expenditures, and anticipating and having the concern of another surprise cut come spring. So happy, fortuitous, but also incredibly cautious going into the spring.
And Mike Jacoby, it's your organization, the Illinois School Business Officials, that really have to make the budget work for each of the schools and remind people that each one of the schools, you're dealing with millions of dollars. If it was a business, you'd think of it as a pretty successful small business. Just before what is the average expenditure for a school? What would be, is it 7 million, 10 million, would you say?
Well, the average overall expense for, I don't really think I even know what the total dollar budget is. I mean, I think we're right around $12,000 per pupil on an average across the state. But I don't really know exactly what the average budget might be.
I was thinking in terms of an individual school. I didn't know, just in other words, would it be?
Right.
But let me go to this. So your group has to make the budget work, school business officials. How are you planning for the year ahead? How can you plan when, given the state of affairs with the budget, the governor's going to be delivering a budget address for the spring when he doesn't have a budget for the last year? Mm-hmm. How is that impacting your ability of your membership to do their job?
Well, there's two things really that are at risk right now, and the most difficult for everybody to deal with. And one of them is that you have to make those decisions on your personnel by April 1. Now, you're probably making that decision this year not knowing whether or not there's enough money to fund this year's budget or have any idea what next year's budget might look like. And, I mean, there's no dialogue yet about methodology. Are we talking about a cut like we did in 2015, or are we talking about a lapsed period of payments that are going to go beyond the end of the fiscal year in terms of the current dollars? But here's the deal, 80% of most school districts' budgets are in people, salaries and benefits. And we have the personnel we have today. We have to make a decision about next year by April 1, and where are we going to be in terms of any resolution on the state's budget for this year and for the future. I mean, that's the biggest question on the table.
And then that Brent Clark, school administrator, so you're putting together a budget, you're trying to hire people. If you make a contract obligation to someone to start in September and then you get a cut come through, what do you do?
You're committed. Under the current statute, we have no ability to retract that commitment. And really, as Dr. Jacoby just said, we have to make those decisions by April 1, well before the budget's set. It's incredibly backwards. It would never stand in the business world. But that's the world that we live in under the current statute with public education. So very awkward, very blinded when you have to enter that. But if you make those commitments and then you find out you've got the cut, you still have to live with the cut. There's no alternative path for you to come back on that.
We talked to one person, I won't identify him right now, off camera, and he was saying that he's been keeping services going by spending down his rainy day fund, but that will be depleted come January. How representative is that of the schools out there who are maybe functioning, operating below their actual costs or revenues below their actual costs, and are using maybe a foundation funding on the sidelines that may or may not be depleted in the short term? How is that happening?
That's widespread. And you know, I've talked to many superintendents in the last 3 or 4 months, and they'll tell you this. They're using this word. We're running on fumes. So they're at the thinnest margins possible to continue operations as they are now.
It's actually a new cost, too. When you deplete your reserves, you run into cash flow issues, which causes you then to have to go borrow money and pay interest to pay payrolls. I mean, that's exactly what the scenario will look like. Mm-hmm. And so what we recommend is sort of a 50% reserve, because you do get your tax payments, and just 2 times a year, and you have to live on those in many cases. And if the state's budget is reduced, diminished at the very end of a fiscal year, you're talking about borrowing, and we don't want to have
cost of that.
We don't want to spend more money to pay our personnel than what we have to, but that's what happens.
Roger, from your group, I mean, school board members, and by the way, I always like to remind people that these people put in all these hours serving on school boards without a dime of compensation. It's really quite a positive civic duty they do. What are you hearing from them as far as how they're trying to keep their schools operating?
Well, they're frustrated. They're facing a lot of challenges, and they want to do things for kids. They'd like to have programs that are meaningful and that would provide great opportunities, but they're having to look at program cuts. They're having to look at larger class sizes. So it's incredibly frustrating. There's a lot of pressure. It hurts. They have to, at the end of the day, along with the administrators, try to forge ahead and make some very difficult decisions. So, it is a difficult time to serve on a school board. And when you couple with the fact that, as you mentioned, this is something folks do without any compensation whatsoever, and often, being stopped in the grocery store or around town or wherever by those folks who don't really like what's going on, but many times those board members are making decisions that they have to make in the face of difficult financial strain. So it's very, very hard right now. We're hearing that. Just a lot of frustration generally with the unknown, and they would like to have a stable and reliable source of revenue so they can plan good programs for their kids.
We won't keep you all too much longer. I would just remind people you spent a good part of your career as a member of the House of Representatives. You were on the budget, or budgeteer, as we say. Knowing what you know, both having worked as an educator yourself and in the state legislature, is there anything that we should be doing fundamentally to change how we fund the schools? Should we be coming out with a biennial budget, or so that those decisions could be made? The money you're going to have in September. What can we do to resolve some of these issues we've heard?
Well, public policy-wise, certainly if we went to some kind of biannual budget, or at least a biannual appropriation for public education, some of these issues would be solved. It's one of the Vision 2020 public policy recommendations to do that. And the other thing is, quite frankly, and there are a lot of people that have said this, we have to pay attention to the modern economy and the fact that we are a service economy now. And I know there are a lot of groups looking at how to produce revenue in a manner that's sustainable and reliable. I think we probably have to look at services and sales tax and try to get away from property taxes. What we're looking at right now is the threat of a property tax freeze. That is our most sustainable and reliable source of revenue. So if there's something that happens with that funding source, there has to be a replacement that's as sustainable and as reliable so that these plans can be made and these guys can do their jobs.
And let's just say, I'll throw it out to both Mike Jacoby and Brent Clark here. So if we had a property tax freeze, if it's being thought about, and it is, you get the ear of a lawmaker, what would you say so that you would say, if you're going to do that, here's what you need to know, Mr. Lawmaker, about the impact on Illinois schools if that happens?
So the most important voice in that particular conversation is going to be the local school superintendent being able to lay out for that local lawmaker the programs that will no longer be offered as a result of that property tax freeze. And if you look across the state, I'll give you a couple examples. Out in the suburbs in Naperville, I talked to the superintendent there back in September and again just this week. The 2-year property tax freeze for him would reduce his revenues by $32 million. $32 million represents a lot of programs for a lot of kids in Naperville. So if I'm him, I have to go to that lawmaker and say, look, if you're going to vote for this, these are the programs we're going to have to reduce down because you're taking away this revenue by voting for this particular freeze. I think it's those firsthand local examples that will really cause the lawmakers to have to think clearly and thoroughly about that vote. And it's a local decision.
Mike, what would you say?
And I would also reference the fact that in much of the state there already is a cap on property taxes, and that cap is based on the Consumer Price Index. Inflation happens in the school district just like it happens in any other kind of part of the world, and so and the fact is, though, those inflational factors have been low. It was 0.8 for this levy year. I mean, that's less than 1% increase in property taxes anywhere. We're looking at next year's, sort of projections, and we're saying it probably somewhere between 0.5 and 1. I mean, so we're not talking about huge, gigantic percentage increases at the local level in most counties across Illinois. So with that in place, you have to ask the question: are we really achieving the kind of savings that we think local taxpayers will cheer for, or are we just hurting the schools, the children, the programs that those children would be able to experience?
Well, gentlemen, I know we could spend a whole day talking about all the issues that impact the schools, but it's getting late in the day. You've been working since early in the morning. I'm sure we'll let you go. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah.